Glad to be here. So I'm going to start off backwards. I'm going to acknowledge all my collaborators first, so you know all the people that had a lot to do with this. This talk is going to combine, just from the wildlife perspective, I guesstimate about 10 published papers. There have been an enormous number of collaborators, several graduate students. I want to acknowledge Katie Greenberg, who's my co-author here. She works for the Southern Research Station, the U.S. Forest Service, and also the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, because I'm going to talk briefly about one study and then more intensely about another. Both of those studies were conducted on game lands in North Carolina, so folks that manage those game lands are the ones that actually put our treatments in place. Specifically, I want to acknowledge Tom Waldrop and Don Hagan because they collected some of the data that I'm going to present today. So I'm going to talk about non-game wildlife. Marcus just mentioned our collaboration, so I do game research, but this is going to focus on non-game species. And the fires that I'm going to talk about, in case I forget later, they're all dormant season burns. So all the fires that I'll talk about today occurred during the dormant season. And these two study areas I'll mention today are in the southern Appalachians of western North Carolina. So the title of my talk is to promote wildlife diversity. So I think we all know that if you want to promote wildlife diversity, you need a diverse array of conditions, vegetation conditions within a stand and among stands across your landscape. So if we want shrub nesting species like indigo bunting or shrubland birds like bobwhite or maybe canopy species like scarlet tanager, we need conditions that accommodate all those species across the landscape. And as you'll see from my talk, if you want lizards and salamanders on your landscape, you're going to have very diverse conditions on your landscape. So how do we achieve those diverse conditions? I think we all know that we achieve those diverse conditions through disturbance. So the disturbance I'll be talking about today is primarily fire, and fire behavior varies according to, earlier we heard about topography, fuel loading, and weather and how it affects fire. And for my talk, that's all going to come into play and how it influences fire intensity. So you can see the aerial photo there on the left. You can see some results of differential fire intensity and how it's affected canopy cover on that landscape. Whereas on the bottom left, you have a low intensity fire that has minor and ephemeral effects on forest structure and composition. And on the right is a more intense fire that has more significant and maybe lasting effects on structure and maybe to a lesser degree composition. And then I want to say what I'll be talking about today is I'm actually going to start off covering a lot on how these treatments affected vegetation structure and composition, because we know from research, our research and other research, that you really need to think about structure when you're trying to predict fire effects on wildlife. And we're not really worried so much about the fire itself and what happens during the actual fire event, but more what happens to the forest structure after the fire. So Todd earlier mentioned the Fire Surrogate Study in western North Carolina on Green River game land. So I'm going to go more in depth into that study, and that's going to be the focus of this talk. So just as a reminder, hopefully because you guys have already heard about the treatments there, this will be easy. There were 4 treatments in this Fire Surrogate study. There's a control and then 3 treatments to reduce fuels. There's mechanical understory reduction, and on our Green River site, that involved hand crews with saws that went through and cut the vegetation, mid-story stems less than 5 inches in diameter, and then understory shrubs. They cut those stems and left them laying on the ground. And the predominant fuel there would be rhododendron and mountain laurel. The other fuel reduction treatment would just be repeated, low intensity, primarily low intensity, late dormant season fires. And then the third treatment would be that mechanical reduction, laying that fuel on the ground, followed by burning. And then there was a control. Green River game land elevation is 366 to 793 meters. It's a primarily oak hickory forest with pitch pine on the ridge tops. And before this experiment started, it had not been thinned or burned for more than 50 years. So today I'm going to talk about a non-game taxa. I'm going to talk about breeding bird response to these treatments, amphibians, with emphasis on woodland salamanders, because you may know that the Southern Appalachians is a global biodiversity hotspot for salamanders, so there's a lot of interest there. I'll talk about reptiles and then shrews. Here's a picture of where Green River Game Lands falls in western North Carolina. It's in Polk County, and you'll see that we had 3 blocks. This was a randomized complete block design. So there are 3 treatment areas or 3 blocks, and each of those blocks had all 4 treatments. So we only have 3 replicates of these treatments. And that gives us fairly low power because there's a lot of variation, as you guys know, on the landscape. So you'll see some of our responses, you may see trends, but they're not significant because of all the variation. And the small sample size maybe didn't allow us to capture some of the more important effects in some cases. So here is a general timeline of the treatments and how they occurred. So initially in the early 2000s, the mechanical removal occurred. The burn only occurred, and then a year after the mechanical, there was the burn and the mechanical and burn. So the picture on the left is just a low-intensity burn only that occurred in the stands, and the picture on the right is what one of the stands would have looked like after that fuel had been hand-cut and laid on the ground. This looks maybe a little bit similar to what we saw yesterday with some of the mowing that was done in the woods and the fuel that gets left on the ground, and that's going to help make your fire more intense. And then after that, the mechanical and the burn received repeated prescribed burning on average about every 4 years. And then we did do another mechanical treatment in 2012, only in the mechanical, not in the mechanical burn. So you don't need to worry about that. So the initial prescribed burn treatments were in March of 2003. This just points out the difference in intensity, which I'm here to talk about today. So the burn only, the average temps you see there. There were patches of higher intensity fire. Katie put this together for me. So 6 to 22% of those treatment areas had more intense fire. Flame lengths 1 to 2 meters, 5 meters in spots. And then the subsequent burns across the study in those burn-only sites were fairly similar, low-intensity, late dormant season fire. The red on the right shows that where we got the very intense fires initially after the mechanical treatment and then burning after that treatment because of all the fuel that was laid on the ground. And the fine fuel in the mechanical and burn was more than 2 times in the burn. So we ended up with more intense fires in those areas. But after that initial intense fire, the subsequent dormant season fires were fairly low intensity. So a lot of what we see in difference among these treatments is going to come from that initial fire. So briefly, I'm going to go through and describe the vegetation conditions and the different treatments. And the top little title will give you a feel for what the take-home message is from each slide, so I don't want you to have to get too into the weeds on this. But the dark green is the mechanical and burn. You can see that's where the real difference is. There was a significant increase in shrub stem density in those treatment areas, but then it would go down for the year after fire. So fire would consume that above ground portion, then it would come back. And you see a little bit of that in the burn-only treatment, where you see some ups and downs with the down occurring immediately after the fire. Leaf litter depth also briefly decreased. You can see those ups and downs with the downs in the burn treatments, both burn only and the mechanical and burn. So soon after the fire, the leaf litter depth is obviously lowered, but then it recovers with leaf fall in the coming years. And you can see that really big increase in the middle. That's when there was a longer period of time between fires, so the leaf litter depth actually recovered to the control levels. So it doesn't take long for these some of these conditions to return back to control levels. That hotter initial prescribed burn and the mechanical and burn killed many of the trees in the overstory, and you can see the mean trees per hectare. But just look at the graph, the trend. You can see that the dark green, which is the mechanical and burn, has a significant reduction in overstory trees over time, and you also see some reduction in the burn only, and that certainly comes from those initial hot, more intense patches in those initial fires, and then maybe some delayed crown mortality over time. Of course, the inverse of that would be dead trees and snags on the landscape. So we had a real large pulse in dead trees that occurred after those really intense initial fires, and then over time those snags fall over, so they're no longer available to cavity nesting wildlife. This will come into play if you're trying to manage for woodpeckers and other cavity nesting birds. So here's some pictures of the forest structure before and after the repeated low-intensity burns and the burn-only treatment. You can see the left, that's kind of what the controls look like. And on the right is what the burn treatment looked like in year 12, 2 years after a third burn. And what you see is that mid-story structure is moved to the understory. And that's the prominent change. There are areas with a few canopy gaps where the hot spots occurred. The changes in the mechanical and burn sites were much more dramatic. Again, you can see an example of a pre-treatment condition on the top left, and then as you move to the right, you see what it looked like 3 years after the treatments. Fairly large number of trees, but we're seeing some delayed tree mortality happen here. And then at the bottom left, 5 years post-treatment. And then in the bottom right, what the condition looked like 12 years post-treatment. And that's 1 year after the third burn. And there's been a fourth burn that has occurred in those treatments since then. And Todd actually talked a lot about the structural or the compositional conditions in those sites. So now I'm here to talk about wildlife. So I've laid the stage on what these sites are like. So I'm going to talk about birds, and just for those of you that care, the bird information was collected via point counts. These point counts lasted 10 minutes. There were 3 points per treatment unit, and there were 3 visits per season, and we were recording all the birds that we saw or heard. And Katie did all of this work, but this from everything from prairie warblers to worm-eating warblers to indigo buntings. So again, focus on the take-home message at the top. The substantial difference here, and on the left is the mean abundance of all birds, and on the right is the species richness of all birds. You can see that dark green line is where the real substantial difference is. So the mechanical and burn treatments, where we had the most significant change in structure, is where we got the greatest increase in overall bird communities. And in the field trip yesterday, my first site, I was in group 2. Our first site was in the retention cut that had been burned once, and probably similar type conditions as what we see here. I was hearing birds that were stacked on top of each other. You get canopy dwelling birds in the retained overstory, but you also get shrub dwelling birds in the understory. Chestnut-sided warblers, indigo buntings with scarlet tanagers singing over the top. One thing to note on the right here is that the mean species richness of birds increased in the burn only as well as in the mechanical burn, and that probably comes from those hot spots and the delayed tree mortality that allows more understory development. Per what Marcus said earlier, you got to get light on the understory for many wildlife species. But you see it up and down, and that up and down is that after the fire, the shrub layer is consumed, so any shrub nesting birds in those forest sites go away until the shrub layer returns. Take-home message here is there are species that are winners after high-intensity burns. Eastern bluebird really did well in the mechanical burn during the middle part of our study. You might say, well, why did they they essentially recovered back to control levels more recently in some of our data, and it's likely because the snags, bluebirds are cavity nesting birds, as those snags fell over, bluebirds lost nesting sites. Towhees continue to be big winners. Yesterday out on our field trip, every site we went to that had been burned, where there was a shrub layer, where there was light, there were towhees singing everywhere. Probably the most abundant bird I heard yesterday on the field trip. Indigo buntings, same winners. I heard them yesterday. And then eastern wood peewees, which are what I would call a woodland bird that prefers open mid-story. It sallies and flies out and eats insects in the mid-story, so it's a big winner when we open up the mid-story, especially when we reduce the canopy cover. There are other species that don't seem to care. Red-eyed vireo, blue-headed vireo, and scarlet tanager in this case did not differ significantly among treatments. You may see some trends here and there, but overall the statistics didn't show significant difference. And then there's some that show negative responses, that they may be prolonged negative responses or they may be short-term negative responses. And because these are really complex graphs, I've actually put little red circles where I want you to focus. The worm-eating warbler is a ground shrub nesting species, so when we reduce leaf litter and we reduce the shrub component after fire in both burn treatments, you see declines, but then you see recoveries over time. So that the little red circle I have there just shows one of those declines after the third burn, but then if you follow that up, it goes right back to control levels, and then it'll decline again, almost like leaf litter does. The ovenbird has a more extended decline, and we know ovenbirds are typically associated with closed canopy forests, so this may be the only loser you would ever see. But you can see where I show that circle when there was a longer extended period between burns, ovenbirds returned to control levels. And then hooded warblers go up and down, typically associated with a reduction of that shrub layer. When the shrub layer recovers, as you see here with that circle, both in the mechanical and burn treatments, hooded warblers come back. So now a bit about Herpetofauna and shrew sampling. We sample these species with what's called drift fences. They're just Y-shaped arrays with metal flashing that's buried in the ground, and they have 5-gallon buckets all over them. And then the critters hit the flashing, fall in the buckets. We use 3 to 4 drift fences per unit. We added 4 for the end of the study, and we were catching salamanders, lizards. This is a fence lizard. And then we caught shrews. I'm going to report on salamanders and lizards for the whole study, but only shrews for a short period of time after the second burn. So amphibians, statistically, no amphibians showed long-term and consistent responses to the treatment. In the benefit of time, I'm just going to focus on B, which are the plethodon salamanders. These are the woodland salamanders, slimy salamanders that are very common, that you would expect to be most effective because they live in these upland areas. There was no significant effect of treatment, but if you see in the middle where I have the arrow, I had a student that showed a significant difference between the burn and mechanical burn and treatment during that period of the study, but that significant difference went away over time. So 2 things there. One, we see the greatest number of plethodon captures in the burn only, and we see the lowest number in the mechanical burn where we reduced overstory. And we know overstory reduction tends to be negative for salamanders. And then in the end, though, I wanted to point out with that red circle that even though there's no difference, the plethodon numbers remain fairly low in the mechanical burn over the long term. Lizards are big winners. This is on the top is 5-line skink, and on the bottom is the fence lizard. And just note that the green bars in the mechanical burn where we have high intensity fires, lower canopy cover, more sunlight. These are species that require the environment to maintain their body temperature, so they need thermoregulatory opportunities, so they really benefit. So lizards are a big winner. I think without disturbance on the landscape, we're not going to have very many lizards in these close canopy forest landscapes. The shrew response, if we combined all shrews over this period, this is after the second burn, no significant difference among the 4 treatments. But if we focus down on a single species, the Southeastern shrew, which was our most common species, we see in that first year that the burn treatments had a reduced number of shrews. And this is associated with leaf litter reduction. So what we see is that species associated with leaf litter decline in abundance, or at least detectability, for the year after a fire, and then they recover as the leaf litter recovers. So you can expect these real up and down dynamics with leaf litter obligates. Finishing up with a very short coverage of a study. It's the Regional Oak Study. It's replicated in 3 places across the country. This is our site at Coal Mountain Game Land in western North Carolina. And this study was aimed to look at the different kind of theories that might be put out there to regenerate oaks. The Pat Bros et al. Approach to shelterwood and burn, just using prescribed burns and the Dave Loftus herbicide treatment. I won't talk about that. I just want to briefly talk about the single low-intensity burn that occurred on this site, and then the shelterwood harvest. Now we're not here to talk about shelterwood harvest. And in this study, the burn after shelterwood harvest has not occurred. So I want to present this data just to show you, reiterate that single low-intensity burns don't do much without a reduction of overstory, but then shelterwood harvests do a lot for wildlife. So this is the game land. All these treatments are replicated 5 times over a large landscape. This is single low-intensity prescribed burn. On the left is pre-burn. On the right is what it looked like after the burn. These burn treatments had no effect on birds because there's no light, there's no change in the overstory, as Marcus said. The left bars are pre-treatment, and the 2 right bars are the years post-treatment. The one place where you see a difference is after the shelterwood. We see an increase in density and richness of birds. Very similar to the high-intensity burn. Shrubland birds were driving this change. On the bottom, you'll see that shrub birds responded very positively to the shelterwood harvest. And that's a picture of the shelterwood harvest on the right. Again, very similar to the high-intensity burn sites. So the message here is that the shelterwood sites look very similar to high-intensity burn sites. Salamanders decreased in the shelterwood sites. That's that actual bar you see, the arrow I have pointed to those circles. Salamanders decreased. You'll see that there are still high numbers of captures in the burn-only units. Lizards increased, very similar to the high-intensity burns. The burn-only treatments had no effect on reptiles and amphibians, similar to birds. All right, so to finish up, some take-home messages. Low-intensity fires that do not reduce canopy cover are going to have very few effects on wildlife. You may have very short-term effects on shrews and other leaf litter obligates. There may be negative effects on ground nesting or shrub nesting birds. There's indication, and I've seen this in other studies, that these low-intensity burns under a fairly heavy canopy cover may benefit salamanders. We see increased numbers of captures of salamanders in these sites. Though it may be related to detection, with the reduction in leaf litter, salamanders may be moving more on the surface, so they may be more likely to be caught. If there is delayed tree mortality because they're in more intense patches of fire, then you will see subtle increases in bird richness and lizard abundance over time. High-intensity fires that reduce canopy benefits lizards and other reptiles, shrubland birds and some woodland birds. They may reduce habitat for salamanders for some period of time. I have maybe because there are mixed results there. They tend to increase community diversity, and they act very similar to shelterwood in many ways. And maybe this high-intensity fires actually may have less effects on some species than shelterwoods. So canopy reduction, Marcus said this exact same thing, is needed for many wildlife. And my point about shelterwoods is if we want to create conditions that are beneficial for some of these species, instead of just counting on high-intensity fires, we can actually go in and remove trees and then implement fire, and we can get there in a way where we make money by harvesting the trees, and maybe there's more predictability about the results because we're not counting on unpredictable fire conditions. And is there any time for questions? Got time for questions? Any questions?